All right, well, I think we're going to begin. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Symposium Fascisms. My name is Neda Tanasowski. I'm a professor and chair of feminist studies at UC Santa Cruz. And I also co-direct the Center for Racial Justice and co-edit the Critical Ethnic Studies Journal with Professor Christine Hong, who is the director of Critical Race and Ethnic Studies and also associate professor of literature here at UC Santa Cruz with me. I'm thrilled to announce today that Christine's book, A Violent Peace, was recently released with Stanford University Press and very relevant to our discussion today, centrally deals with fascism. The Center for Racial Justice, which is sponsoring today's event, is a new center founded in 2019 to serve as a hub for discussions around race at Santa Cruz, which until 2013 had actually been one of the only UCs not to have an ethnic studies major. The center brings artists, activists, and intellectuals working within and outside the university to campus. And our theme for this year's events, which we decided on prior to Zoom Universe, is no liberation in isolation, but I think it is still applicable. And we're working this year towards events culminating in a summer institute that will focus on political education, pardon me. So today I'm tremendously excited to be introducing the first Center for Racial Justice event of the year, organized in conjunction with the Critical Ethnic Studies Journal. This is a two-part symposium on fascisms that has been convened by Professors Alyosha Goldstein and Simon Ventura Trujillo, who will co-edit a special issue of the journal on this topic, and it will feature contributions by panelists. So in addition to today's panel, which focuses on fascism and organized violence, next week's panel, which will be held at the same time on November 4th, will address fascism and regimes of knowledge. Before introducing Simon and Alyosha, who will speak more about the special issue and symposium, I would just like to say a few words about some of the changes that Christine and I, as the new co-editors alongside our board, have implemented for the Critical Ethnic Studies Journal. In addition to publishing urgent issues like this one on fascisms, we want the journal to feature work that reflects the history of ethnic studies as political education. The journal is now online and open access, and we hope that as such, it can be a dynamic forum for vital generative conversations between and among scholars at all ranks, activists, artists. And the journal now features several new sections, including interviews with activist collectives and artists, also political education documents, including pamphlets, manifestos, community archives, and finally syllabi that mark pressing, emergent, or under-theorized areas of concern in the field of critical ethnic studies. So without further ado, I'm thrilled to introduce today's panel conveners and co-editors of the upcoming special issue on fascisms. And I'll keep the intros brief, since you'll be able to find longer bios on the Center for Racial Justice website. Alyosha Goldstein is professor and director of graduate studies in the Department of American Studies at the University of New Mexico. And he's the author of Poverty in Common, The Politics of Community Action During the American Century, among many, many other important publications. And Simon Ventura Trujillo is an assistant professor of Latinx Studies in the Department of English at NYU. His first book is Land Uprising, Native Story Power and the Insurgent Horizons of Latinx Indigeneity. So thank you all for joining us, and Alyosha and Simon, I will turn things over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Neda and Christine. It's a real pleasure to be here. And so what I would like to do is first thank everyone for joining and to give a brief overview of what Alyosha and I are kind of attempting to do with this special issue on fascisms. it is no secret that we are kind of living in a moment of danger, and that moment of danger is a long time coming and has many pockets and many iterations. And so, authoritarian political leaders and violent racist nationalist movements are indeed a resurgent feature of our present historical conjuncture, not only in the United States, but places such as Brazil, India, the Philippines, Turkey, and Hungary, just to name a few. And so we're trying to see this issue as a way of responding to the urgency of the contemporary political crisis. And in particular by exploring what the analytic of fascism offers for understanding this authoritarian convergence. And we in particular want to center the material and speculative labor of anti-fascist and anti-racist social movement coalitions. And so we envision essays in this issue as building a critical conversation across multiple world contexts and exploring a variety of ways of theorizing what fascism and anti-fascist movements might mean for our current contemporary moment, or even historically with relevance for the contemporary moment. And so, one of the things we struggled a lot about with the title, and we kind of finally centered on fascisms, plural. And so by emphasizing it as a plurality, we really seek to address two problematics. First, we're trying to come to terms with this global proliferation of fascist formations within and beyond the US and Europe over the course of the Cold War and into our contemporary moment. And at the same time, we're trying to really work against a facile evocation of fascism, especially from liberal positions that overlook the historic relationality that fascism and liberal democracy share. And so we are interested in fascism as an elusive political and cultural phenomenon, one that arises through a geopolitically diverse series of entanglements with liberalism and neoliberalism, white supremacy, racial capitalism, imperialism, heteropatriarchy, and settler colonialism. And more pressingly, I think one of the things we're trying to also really center is the historic, political, and epistemological variety of anti-fascist collective organizing undertaken by Black, Indigenous, and other racialized subjects across the planet. And we want to do this in a way that kind of challenges the usual Eurocentrism through which studies of fascism often proceed. I think one of the things we're really committed to is really centering the ways in which racialized and colonized peoples have always been at the forefront of theorizing dismantling fascism. And we intend for this issue to be a venue to explore, theorize, and activate this work. Thank you.
So I just want to start also by thanking Christine, Netta, Trung Nguyen, Taylor Ansley, Lisa Supple, and Tony Boardman for hosting this week's and next week's panels. It's really a lot of work to put all this together, so thank you for doing that. And so what I'm going to do is just kind of provide a little bit of setup for the panelists, and I won't take up too much time, but I just wanted to say, to actually just kind of echo a few of the points that Simone just made. So, as Simone said, our focus in the critical ethnic studies issue on fascisms really is thinking about the analytic of fascism as entangled in the vectors of imperialism, colonialism, and racism in various ways across time and place. This is something I think that is really at the forefront of what we see the intervention of this issue being. And that intervention, I think, has a long genealogy. If we think about Claudia Jones, George Padmore, Amy Césaire, among others, who emphasized the colonial context of fascism during the early and mid-20th century, it's a really important set of references. And our intention with the issue is both to kind of be in conversation with those longer radical critiques, but also to ask what it means to think not only of fascism as being entangled with European and American imperialism, but really what contexts where settler colonial circumstances, where the conditions of practices of colonial fascism are perhaps in some way fundamental to the ongoing conditions of liberal democracy, as Simone was saying. So hence, it's a way to speak to the perceived urgency of our current moment, but also the way in which in our current moment, for some, it seems to be a sudden evocation of fascism as a new phenomenon. We're really trying to kind of move beyond a kind of an exceptionalization of somebody like Trump and the Trump administration, to think about the ways in which, and really, as our contributors kind of make clear, Black, Indigenous, people of color organizing against imperialism, colonialism, capitalism, and white supremacy have frequently noted that fascism shapes these contexts that they confront. So anyway, I'm just going to say quickly a little bit about what we've asked the panelists to speak to, and then I'll provide some brief introductions to our amazing panelists for today. So as a starting point for today's speakers, talking about fascism and organized violence, we've asked them to discuss the essays that they're working on. So they're not presenting the essays that as they're are kind of fully developed. They're in the process of writing these essays that will be part of the special issue. And we've asked them today to speak about those essays in light of the following questions, which again echo some of the points that Simone has already spoken to. So the first question we asked was, what might the analytic of fascism offer or obscure for understanding the present authoritarian convergence? The second question, in what ways might the focus of their essays is ask us to rethink the significance or historical and political dynamics of this convergence? And finally, what broader horizons or relations of anti-racist, anti-imperialist, and anti-capitalist struggle are at stake in what they're writing about? And so in asking them to speak about these, just sort of to take into consideration how they're formulating their own ideas, and they're going to speak to those questions to whatever extent they want to. We're very fortunate to have with us today three amazing speakers. I'm going to provide just very brief introductions, but as Netta had said earlier, the full bios are available on the UCSC Center for Racial Justice webpage, and I'd encourage you to look at that because they're all quite accomplished and are doing incredible work. One other point to just make as we're moving into the presentations is for audience members, if you would like to ask questions, to pose those in the Q&A function of the Zoom, because that's what we'll be able to return to and compile questions from. We're not going to be able to obviously get to all the questions posed. This really is intended to be a kind of a point of departure for further conversation. But in any case, what I'd like to do now is introduce, and I'll introduce each one of the speakers in the order that they're going to speak, and I'm going to do all the introductions at once, and then we'll just move to the presentations, so that way flows more directly than me intervening after each presentation with a new introduction. So we're going to begin with Alan Lumba, who is an assistant professor of history at Virginia Tech, and his first book, Monetary Authorities, Capitalism and Decolonization in the American Colonial Philippines, is forthcoming from Duke University Press. We'll then move to Ann Spice, who's a Tlingit member of the Kwanlin Dun First Nation, a queer Indigenous feminist, anti-colonial organizer, and acting assistant professor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at Ryerson University. Her work is in the tradition of feminist activist ethnography and supports Indigenous land defense against settler state and extractive industry invasion. And then finally, we'll have Johanna Fernandez, who is an associate professor of history at Baruch College at the City University of New York. She's the author of The Young Lords, A Radical History, which was just published this year by University of North Carolina Press, as well as the editor of Writing on the Wall, Selected Prison Writings of Mumia Abu-Jamal from Sibylites Books. She also wrote and produced the film Justice on Trial, The Case of Mumia Abu-Jamal. So without further ado, we'll turn to our presentation, starting with Alan. And again, I'm grateful for our speakers for joining us, and thanks to you all for joining us as well.
All right, y'all can hear me okay, I'm assuming. I'm just going to share my screen real quick. Let's do this. Okay. First, just to acknowledge that where I'm at, Virginia Tech, is on Tatalo Monacan land. Even though we're on Zoom, just want to situate myself where I am. Thank you to Simone and Alyosha and the Critical Ethnic Studies Journal, the staff at UC Santa Cruz Center for Racial Justice, obviously for inviting all of us here, and especially Professor Spice and Professor Fernandez, who I'm very honored to share this space with and to learn so much from. So for this essay, I've been focusing mainly on Rodrigo Duterte, current president of the Philippines. I've been thinking about whether fascism is a useful analytic for thinking about the Duterte regime, or does it give too much of a feeling of exceptionalism to the state and popular violence under Duterte? One of the first questions I want to think about is how could a colonial analytic be more generative than an analytic of fascism? This question has much to do with how many in the Philippines, other than the left and some liberals, are very cautious about using the term fascism to describe Duterte's government. Despite his violent attacks on civil society, particularly the kinds of dissent in media, and civility, he is willfully vulgar and profane. Duterte remains politically slippery. The elusiveness of his ideological commitments leads to only a handful of critics, as I mentioned, to actually utter fascist. To me, Duterte's only stable ideological commitment seems to be punitive justice. He's nicknamed the Punisher, and his commitment to public authority and national security is structured by this idea of punishment. Although known for the mass murders in his so-called drug war, Duterte's desire to punish extends to all those that appear as threats to authority and security. For example, the Duterte government has aggressively targeted media groups, activists, and organizers, and even celebrities, claiming that they are engaging in acts of sedition. Sedition charges operates through the fear of revolution, justifying any means necessary from intimidation to imprisonment, all the way to assassination to enforce security and establish order. Take, for example, something like the recently passed anti-terror law. The vagueness of the law was denounced by leftists, liberals, and human rights groups, arguing that any form of dissent or support of dissent could be interpreted as a threat to public and private safety. Moreover, the law allowed for the state to conduct surveillance, detainment, and even incarcerate suspects for life, according to their law. This meant that authorities would not only have unchecked powers, but also those accused would have very little legal protections or recourse. Another recent instance of punishing any sort of sedition is called red tagging. This is an extra state practice of justifying attacks on public figures by implicating them as communists or communist sympathizers. In a country with the longest ongoing Maoist armed rebellion in Asia, the New People's Army is what they're called, any sort of social justice demand or form of political dissent can be red tagged by authorities and portrayed as a form of sedition or treason against the government. Those who have discussed red tagging correctly see it as a kind of state violence. But what is interesting to me is how critics have framed this as a question of liberal freedoms and rights, rather than the ongoing colonial logics of counter-revolution. And I'm curious about this because contemporary Philippine laws on sedition can be traced back to US colonialism. The original 1901 Sedition Act, which was established during an ongoing counter-decolonization campaign known as the Philippine-American War, threatened to punish any desire for liberation with death or incarceration. Moreover, cultural productions like plays and literature, and even paraphernalia like flags, were labeled as threats against the authority of the colonial state. Contemporary liberals would consider colonial anti-sedition laws as crude, barbaric, and uncivil. However, the disproportionate punishment for acts of dissent or expressions of liberation was how American colonizers sought to teach native Filipinos the rule of law. In the colonies, counter-revolutionary punishment by death or incarceration is justified as a civilizational uplift and racial progress. So this reminds me of Césaire's critique of the European shame over fascism, that violence and barbarism are coded as civilization in the colonies, but suddenly appears as fascism once that violence and barbarism returns to Europe. Césaire's critique urges us to rethink concepts such as fascism, liberal institutions, and civil society, that the categorization of these powers as distinct from one another could only be possible within and through colonial violence. I'm especially reminded to question the seeming distinction between fascism, perceived as a coercive kind of power, and liberalism perceived as a consensual kind of power. But this distinction between consensual and coercive does not necessarily make sense in the colony, particularly to those colonized. All social arrangements are by force in the colony. All policies of welfare are backed by the threat of warfare. All policies of warfare are justified as welfare. I think Duterte's regime has exposed that in the post-colony, colonial violence has not really ended. There is no civil society. There is only a fantasy of civility. There is no post-war civilian rule. Everything is still, structurally speaking, military rule. Here I'm provoked by radical indigenous thinking on settler colonialism, which argues that colonialism is ongoing and war is perpetual. To me, in addition to analyzing settler colonialism as a discrete category, I believe radical indigenous thinking aggravates a challenge to the post-colonial world. It asks, do you really believe yourself to be liberated? With this in mind, the Philippines, despite supposedly achieving nominal sovereignty, remains in a state of perpetual and total war, which is to say colonial war. And government policies are driven by counter-revolution and anti-sedition. This reminds me of Fanon's argument that the colonizer is preoccupied with security and is always already prepared to test brute force against the masses. I think the most notorious example of colonial war is Duterte's so-called drug war. Duterte's promise to bring peace and order by punishing security threats of drug smugglers, traders, dealers, and addicts has been most spectacularly covered by international publics. Since 2016, murders from police and vigilantes have been estimated from 6,000 to over 20,000. Additionally, there are almost 200,000 officially imprisoned or detained in a carceral system that was built for a tenth of that number. Despite what some critics may argue, the drug war has not been bad for business. The drug war's accumulation of bodies sheds light on racial capitalism's capacity to profit from gratuitous violence. Racial capitalism devalues a body's life, but at the same time can valorize the body through dispossession. Vince Raphael, for instance, has written about the microeconomics of the drug war, the ways that police quotas and funerals can monetize the accumulation of corpses. The seized narcotics are publicly appraised by police, illuminating the fungibility of dead bodies to the street price of drugs. And as Black radical thinking reminds us, fungibility, accumulation, and gratuitous violence are all necessary components for the production of racial capitalism's political and libidinal economy. Duterte's cross-class popularity, he's actually has at a recent approval rate of about 92, 93%, is grounded in this libidinal investment in public safety. At the same time, Duterte's war on drugs and revolution is bundled along with the budgeting of infrastructure and development, illustrating its macroeconomic implications. For example, since 2016, the United States has provided about $554 million in military assistance to his regime. The proposed 2021 national budget has allocated a combined 450 billion pesos to the Philippine National Police, the Department of National Defense, the security of the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, and the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict. Additionally, for the upcoming year, over 3 trillion pesos will be added to the national debt, with about 400 billion pesos directly from foreign lenders. So in this case, macroeconomic accumulation actually trickles down to the microeconomic, with a substantial chunk of the budget actually going to increasing the salaries the increasing the salaries, the pensions, and the life insurance for military and police personnel. In conclusion, these wars on drugs and revolution, the gratuitous violence against racialized and impoverished people that we see in the Philippines, it's a significant form of accumulation, not just in the Philippines, but for, I would argue, the capitalist world. And this is what I've been thinking about. This suggests that a society of perpetual war and the punitive economy are not exceptional forms, only emerging during authoritarian or fascistic regimes. Instead, for post-colonial places like the Philippines, war and punishment may be the only kinds of social relations acceptable to a world built around racial capitalism. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So move to Anne next.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I'm really honored to be on this panel and excited to be in conversation with the other scholars here and to everyone in the audience. So I started thinking about this piece in a strange way. I haven't used fascism in a really serious way to think about what's happening in the context up here. So I started thinking about how the analytic of fascism applies. And in a moment where Indigenous struggle is, we're trying to find ways to align ourselves with anti-fascist and anti-racist movements elsewhere, what the analytic offers, and then also what the challenges are. So in this moment, there's this line that people are using in the States under Trump that if he gets elected again, they need to escape. And one of the places where they're saying they need to escape to is north of the border to so-called Canada. And this is also in a moment where Indigenous resistance to industrial and colonial invasions is happening and intensifying across the country. And so what does it mean to be escaping to Canada, escaping a sort of more authoritarian regime, the possibilities of increasing fascist mobilizations, escaping to another colonial and settler colonial state. And I think it speaks to the willingness of the public to be complicit in colonial processes and to participate in colonialism if it means that is an alternative to a sort of fascist regime. So I'm thinking about participatory democracy as also coming with a whole set of colonial baggage and what it means to be signing on to that or suggesting that it might be an alternative. And I think people look to Canada as a kind of kinder, gentler face of colonialism with our reconciliation politics and talks of nation-to-nation discussions between Indigenous people and the state, and see it as a possible sort of more just liberal democracy. And so I want to talk about what some of the dangers of that are, and I'm in this case using a kind of report from the field, from the front lines of Indigenous land defense, specifically on Wet'suwet'en territory, where there have been multiple invasions over the past few years and police raids to bring down dissent and any kind of opposition to industrial projects that are proceeding through the territory without consent. And so I'm thinking about the criminalization of land defense and what that tells us about the operations of fascism and the possibilities of anti-fascist organizing. So there's this kind of daily dispossession, and the way that this functions on Wet'suwet'en territory and on other Indigenous front lines, I think speaks to the really sort of daily quotidian violences that accumulate in spaces of Indigenous land defense and that have urgency to those of us who are on the front lines in a way that might not be fully visible to people on the outside, and create spaces of what I want to call carceral geographies that are creating spaces of unfreedom for Indigenous people on our own territories. So I want to think about the front lines of Indigenous land defense and how criminalization of Indigenous land defense functions. And I think there's two main ways that this happens. I forgot to hit my timer, so I'm just gonna, it's 3:30, okay. So the first is the erosion of our rights as Indigenous people. And historically, we were cast as wards of the state. And as new participants or citizens in democracy, we could only participate in the democracy as voting citizens if our claims to land were neutralized. So before 1960, that meant that if people were enfranchised, it meant giving up your Indian status and giving up claims to Aboriginal rights. After 1960, we're welcomed as democratic citizens as long as we do not reclaim our lands. And if we do so, it moves to another strategy to criminalize us. And that's sort of this active criminalization of our existence. And that's happened throughout history through a number of different historical movements and pieces of legislation. It included outlawing the existence of our laws and systems of governance through things like the potlatch ban, which outlawed our feast system on the Northwest Coast, which was our main system of governance and our main sort of economic driver as well. It meant outlawing hunting and fishing practices, which meant that Indigenous people were criminalized for hunting out of season, or for selling their fish, or for using the wrong forms of technology to fish. And that our ancestors were jailed for doing such things that were meant to create our survival as peoples. And so there's a long historical trajectory of outlawing and criminalizing Indigenous practices of survival. And so this happens under this current reconciliation government through bureaucratic and legal mechanisms that are meant to clear the way for industry and to allow access to our territories and end up criminalizing Indigenous people for our continued existence on the territories and then our continued resistance to the forces that are trying to gain access and to extract from those territories. So that includes things like permits for industrial and extractive projects that do not require the consent of the Indigenous title holders of the territory. In this case, in the case of Wet'suwet'en territory, that would be the House Group Chiefs. So there's a bureaucratic way that this is functioning through the paperwork of the state that already sort of casts Indigenous peoples as outside of that process and then ignores the lack of consent and allows permits to be handed over to industry and then allows these projects to occur. And then there's an additional sort of layer of civil law that has made injunctions the main mechanism for removing Indigenous dissent and in any sort of blockage to the possibility of these projects proceeding. So the way that injunction law functions, it's these injunctions are civil injunctions that are put in place to make sure that Indigenous people or anyone else can't block access to industry. When they hit the courts and they hit these court hearings, they are considered below the level of any kind of constitutional challenge. And so discussion around who the proper title holders are of the territory, about Aboriginal rights and how those rights can be upheld, all that discussion is set aside for a higher court. And the injunction proceeds with the concerns of industry sort of held up as the highest standard. And so it effectively sort of shuffles around Indigenous concerns so that they're not able to be addressed in the lower courts without having to mount a full title case or constitutional challenge. So then our Aboriginal rights basically cannot be protected or guaranteed by the lower courts. And when the injunctions go through, and when they have gone through over the past couple of years, it means that the police can then move in to enforce the injunction to remove Indigenous people from the way and to allow access, to force access for the industrial projects that are happening on the territories. And so this happens in a number of different ways. It happens by casting Indigenous people as extremists. There's definitely parallels with what's happening in the Philippines. And it sort of criminalizes the existence of people on the territories. And so this year, there was the sort of continuation of a fight against this injunction. And after the injunction was upheld, hereditary chiefs on Wet'suwet'en territory evicted Coastal GasLink pipeline company from the territory, and workers were invited to leave. They did. The territory was held for about a month, and others were blockaded out from entering the territory. And then at the beginning of February, there were a series of police raids on the territory, which came in to remove Indigenous people and others who were supporting at gunpoint. And so they brought in a massive tactical force, which I think, again, sort of exposes the violent sort of underlay of this whole system, that despite the reconciliation politics and despite the way that the current government talks about their intentions with Indigenous people and negotiation, that at the end of the day, when it's industry's interests at play, they'll send in the guns, and they did. And so part of my piece will be talking a bit more about the experience of that, of being criminalized, and of sort of experiencing that on the territory. It's not only the spectacular moments of removal, but the constant harassment and surveillance, the fact that nobody can go out hunting, even currently to this day, without having a police cruiser waiting for them on the road when they come back from the bush, that it continues to be the case that we are so heavily surveilled and have this information collected about us that the state is waiting for the possibility to cast us again as criminals for continuing to exist on the territory and continuing to hunt and survive in these ways. So this trick then is to give all of this the facade of democracy. And in a sort of demographic situation where Indigenous people make up 4.9% of the Canadian population, what we're told is that we have an equal say. Our say is equal to anyone else, including all of the people who are occupying our territories. And so this colonial trick says that when we say no, it's recast as a veto. And I've seen this function in a lot of discussions around Indigenous movements, that in this sort of strange irony, we get cast as the fascist ones for being a minority, making claims on a sort of democratic society that we are seen as not having a right to. So despite the fact that white settlers voted themselves the lords of the territory and are then continuing to occupy it in whatever way they see fit, we get cast as the ones who are anti-democratic and even pseudo-fascist. And so I think there's a real need to then really critically interrogate the language of democracy and the way that we're positioned in relation to that language, especially as it functions as in sort of liberal and white liberal circles. And to also note that colonial occupations don't need to be fascist in order to be genocidal. And it's the history of genocidal policy and practice that liberal democracies like Canada share with fascist powers. And so we need to remember that history and also look at the ways that that is functioning in the present. So in order for us as Indigenous people and as Indigenous land defenders to be aligned with anti-fascist struggle, to continue to work in ways that are anti-colonial or anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, we need to look at what tools of dispossession are. What are the actual tools that are being used? Who's the enemy? And how do we then dismantle those tools of oppression? So I think it's good to keep the focus on the police and the militarization of police as something that is manifesting both in our context and contexts of anti-Black racism and sort of consolidation of white nationalist movements. And also to look beyond the options offered to us by colonial governments, that we really need to think about what livable futures we are building. I think we're accumulating a sort of set of things that we are anti, and sometimes forgetting to think about what we're for and what it is we want to be building with each other, and that work is really crucial if we're going to be moving forward. And that what we don't want to build is just another settler colonial democratic paradise for people who are going to continue to trample Indigenous rights in order to get what they want. And so it's about thinking about livable futures and how we can build those alliances and build them in strategic and critical ways. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne. Move to Johanna.
Hi there. First, I want to thank Alyosha and Simone for the invitation, and I am happy, although exhausted, to be able to think through some of these questions. It's a challenge. It's not an easy one. And I just want to make sure that you can all hear me because I'm got these things on. Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna offer a definition of fascism, traditional one, Marxist one. And I just want to make sure that you're all with me. So fascism emerges, and I think there's consensus around this, although we don't often, go through the process of describing exactly what it is that we're talking about when we're talking about fascism. But fascism emerges at a particular moment in the history of capitalism. And it is a form of government, in many cases of last resort, in which government merges with finance and industrial capital. To what end? For the purposes of saving capitalism from a crisis of overaccumulation and a crisis of overproduction in capitalism, but also to save capitalism from the formidable threat posed to capitalism by an organized and increasingly revolutionary working class. That's also proposing an alternative to capitalism, socialism. And what's important about this phenomenon is that it relies on the buy-in and self-mobilization of an impoverished middle class of shopkeepers and middling professionals who are deputized to carry out acts of repression against the perceived enemy. And this class of impoverished middle class shopkeepers and middling professionals is self-deputized, and it's collaborating with the state, with the repressive fascist state. Out of this class is drawn the proverbial citizen foot soldiers of fascism, a class of people displaced by capitalism who are deeply dissatisfied with the system and whose needs the system cannot and will not meet. The wage that sustains this disgruntled class is a psychological one that puts the onus of their misery on those perceived inferior to them, the outsiders, immigrants, racialized groups, and those demonized by the fascist government. And here we've heard this or read this. Here we're thinking about W.E.B. Du Bois's formulation of the psychological wages of white supremacy in the United States. So the period in American history that most closely resembles these dynamics of fascism in its totality, like all of these dynamics in their totality, the period in American history that most resembles this is the era of the Jim Crow South. In this period, the old planter class, they were the slave-owning class before the Civil War, launched a counter-revolution to consolidate its power. This is during the era of Reconstruction and beyond. And the landowning class, the planter class, which was invited to remake society after the Civil War, which is anathema and counterintuitive, right? The Civil War was a revolutionary situation. It challenged the institution of slavery, but the dominant class under slavery was literally invited back to remake that society. And when that happens, in all revolutionary situations, there's a counter-revolution that's launched, which is going to deploy terror. So that land-owning class, as it launches this counter-revolution, literally joins both parties. It also restructures itself economically. That's the old planter class, to consolidate economic power. And it becomes a landlord merchant class. I don't have time to go into this, but the history of the South during Reconstruction and beyond is absolutely fascinating, because here you have a struggle by the former slave owners to remake themselves. In order to do that, it had to control the previously enslaved Black labor that its economy was dependent on under slavery, and continue to be dependent on after the end of slavery, during Reconstruction and beyond. Part of the counter-revolution of the old planter class involves the deployment of terror against the freedmen. That's what the former slaves were called. And the deployment of terror against the freedmen comes in the form of the KKK. So this is the moment that the KKK emerges. It's part of this counter-revolution. And what we know from history is that all revolutions are accompanied by counter-revolutions, and counter-revolutions deploy terror. So the class, the counter-revolutionary class that's deploying terror, and that we might argue is fascistic, because it's literally in control of the economy and literally joining or becoming the government. This class recruits poor and working class white people to the project of white supremacy, and lynchings become a communal activity. So at least a segment of white people who are not part of the old planter class become the foot soldiers of the system of repression that needs to contain Black labor. And Trump is so successful because his propaganda fits well with the ideology that the remnants of the old South has been feeding generations and generations of school children, that the Confederacy fought a valiant fight for the dignity of the glorious South under slavery, although slavery is never mentioned, that Southerners were victims of Northern tyranny, abuse, and corruption, and that the North forsaked those of their own glorious race, that's Lincoln and company, to give the crown jewels of the South to a criminally minded, inept, undeserving race. That's the freedmen, the former slaves, who, by the way, whose men pose a threat, a violent threat to white women in the form of rape. So, I mean, I'm just thinking out loud here about the relationship between Trump and moments of fascism or fascist currents in American history. And I think that you can argue that that Trump represents the consolidation of that counter-revolution launched by the old planter class after the Civil War. But we can also say that the entire history of the United States has well prepared the country for the advent of proto-fascist currents. The Northern American colony, for example, made gun ownership by white men and women of all classes compulsory. And it had to do this in the face of Native American and slave rebellion. So this is where the Second Amendment comes from. Gun ownership was necessary, and the emerging states subsidized gun ownership among white men and women in order to secure the borders and integrity of the nascent colonial state. And this is an argument found in this incredible little book, Loaded, A Disarming History of the Second Amendment by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. War with Indians during this period of the early emerging American state led to the development of the concept of savage war, which is, by the way, the logic of US military intervention all around the world. And savage war is the targeting and killing of civilians, women, and children by self-organized militias for the purposes of consolidating the state. So even the militia is a product of the colonial project in this country. And then there's the slave patrols. I don't have time to go into this right now. But the slave patrols, that's another example of white Americans being deputized and conscripted to return escaped slaves to the plantation. This is where the first police departments in the United States come from. Beyond that history, if we think about the history of the United States in the 19th and 20th century, especially in the 20th century, the country has, in many ways, groomed a conservative citizenry. At least a section of the citizenry, of the white citizenry, has been groomed to be very conservative, self-deputized. So it's been fed a strong diet of anti-communism. In the 20th century, European immigrants were subjected to Americanization campaigns during World War I that compelled workers, immigrant workers, generations, second and third generation of European immigrant workers to abandon their language and their culture and their old world ways. So there's this Americanization campaign that's tied to war, patriotism, and salute of the flag. But that Americanization campaign makes patriotism synonymous with repression and anti-communism. In the United States, folks lived in remote rural settings. Some still do. After the 1950s, I'm talking about the white population. After the 1950s, most white Americans and middle class, working class and middle class white Americans were suburbanized, and people of color were excluded from the suburbs. So the majority of white and middle class, working class folks today live atomized in private homes. This really makes for a very conservative, almost reactionary, potentially what's the word I'm looking for, susceptible to conspiracy theories, potentially, because they're atomized and isolated. They've been fed a long-standing diet of propaganda, media propaganda. They've been taught to fear Black people and Black crime. They've also been raised on a strong diet of middle-class individualism. They're living with high levels of indebtedness, and they're undergoing hardship. I don't know if you've heard, but small businesses have been eviscerated in this pandemic moment. Many folks in the United States within the suburbs, but across the country, are working in the gig economy, which promotes individualism. And this class of people who live isolated, atomized, are Americans, are resentful of the other. They've seen the end of the American dream. I think we all have, but they especially have seen the end of the American dream. And finally, if we think about the conditions that the economic conditions that accompany the threats of this moment, globally, there is a crisis of capitalism. There's a crisis of overaccumulation and overproduction. That means that there's an enormous amount of capital in the global economy that has not found an outlet. The new frontier for capitalist expansion, which historically allows capitalism to get itself out of a crisis of overproduction, hasn't been found. And that was the case after the recession of 2008. It's a deeper crisis of overaccumulation and overproduction now. And we have a situation in which people are miserable, unemployed, underemployed, living on the edge of the economy, both domestically and globally. And we're seeing the beginnings of uprisings. The only thing that we don't see happening in the United States, which accompanies usually the need on the part of capitalism to resort to fascism, is a revolutionary resistance on the part of workers at the point of production, challenging capitalism and proposing an alternative. So those are some thoughts. Beyond that, beyond this framework that I've thought about, then we've seen in the post-World War II period a cranking up of the apparatus of repression, the militarization of the police, the expansion of prisons, the professionalization of the military after Vietnam. So historically, the military has been an entity that is expected to perhaps side with the people in a revolutionary situation, because its rank and file is drawn from the working class. But after the Vietnam War and the Soldiers' Rebellion, the American empire decided that it was no longer going to depend on the working class to build its or the draft to build its military, that it was going to create a military that's professionalized. So that all points to a society that, in the context of a progressive rebellion from the left, is going to rain an enormous amount of repressive violence on those who challenge the status quo.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of your really generative presentations. And what I'd like to do before turning to questions posted by the audience who are listening online or watching online, is just to invite you each to, if there are aspects of presentations, your presentations that you want to respond to kind of start the conversation between one another. So I invite you guys to, if you have comments on what one another spoken, I think there's already a lot of really interesting resonances across what everyone's spoken about. So. Maybe I'll prompt one set of connections, which is just thinking about, I mean, where Joanna was just leaving off in terms of this sort of the intensification of the kind of conditions of present formation under kind of global capital and the sort of stresses and strains of that, the way in which particular forms of militarization, policing become acute and violence gets deployed in particular ways. It seems to me to be a point that came up across all three presentations, and maybe are there ways that Alan, Anne, or Johanny want to speak to those connections across the different contexts you were speaking about?
Can you reframe that question?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the point where you ended about talking about the sort of the intensification of the ways in which violence is being deployed under these conditions, right? And it seems like, you know, that's what Alan is talking about in the Philippines and Duterte, definitely in terms of what Wet'suwet'en is facing under the kind of Canadian colonial state, and a kind of ramping up of surveillance and different forms of counterinsurgent warfare. It's what we see happening throughout the United States, the so-called United States now, that these kind of the modes of racialized policing and the kind of, again, the kind of ramping up of these conditions. And all of that, I mean, as Joanna, you were describing so well, through the recruitment of the sort of those who are sort of unofficial representatives of the state, the kinds of vigilantism, militia members, that kind of those unofficial forms through which white folks are recruited, or folks who identify it in a way that allows them to kind of see themselves attached to or aligned with the kind of forms of power that exist. That they're recruited to participate in these very escalating or accelerating, intensifying forms of violence. So I'm just wondering if there are ways to make the connection across the different contexts that you all were speaking.
Well, I'll speak. I mean, there are all kinds of different ways to think about the hyper-militarization of American society, the police. We might as well be a Latin American dictatorship, right? But in many ways, a society that's so savagely unequal has to crank up its apparatus of repression. One especially that's not meeting human need. It also has to create scapegoats. So, I mean, this is something that I talk about periodically. I mention that the United States has seen the largest transfer of wealth that has ever happened in history, from the bottom of society and the middle classes to the top. And when this kind of transfer of wealth has happened, it's happened because of a military coup or a revolution. And in the United States, it's happened kind of without much ado, right? In terms of a struggle that exposes that kind of economic violence. So that is a society that is profoundly unstable, and it has to be contained. It's contained by deploying terror against those most likely to resist, historically Black Americans, in unequivocal ways. Like, Black Americans just finished burning down a a precinct in America, Minneapolis, right? So that population is going to have to be contained, and it was deindustrialized, right? It was jobless, and deindustrialization. We tend to think of deindustrialization as a white thing, but in fact, it hit communities of color in urban centers first after World War II. Permanent unemployment began to be studied by the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the 60s in New York, because it was a thing among Puerto Rican and Black American young workers. Those people have to be warehoused, and that's what the carceral project is about. It's about containing these people who are likely to resist, but also redundant. But also it sends a message to others. You know, it keeps other people in their place. And these people become scapegoats, the folks who were racialized, blamed. This is the stuff of fascism. You blame these people as the enemy, the undeserving leeches of the system that need to be further contained through vigilante violence and state violence.
Well, just to quickly just build off that, I think what is interesting is this idea of vigilantism. I think I think one of the questions, I don't think everybody could see it, but it was about what makes fascism, right? And I think there is something about that micro power, the micro level of desire to want to enact that violence or to do that repression. You don't have to wait for the state. You do it because you are the state in a way, right? A particular extension of it. And in some ways, that's very much in line with what Professor Spice was said about democracy, right? The settler notion of democracy is like, I am sovereign. I have a voice. I can enact this kind of force for the state, for the good life, perhaps, for everyone. And so when people push back against it, those who are excluded from civil society or democratic society, they're seen as someone who are supposedly disrupting or endangering the sort of the unity of the nation state or a particular kind of order and security. And I think I see that in the Philippines especially, and I'm not the first one to think about this, but I think the ways that Duterte, for example, is immensely popular, cross-class, and he came across campaigning on weeding out the corruption in government, getting rid of the oligarchies, the landed property, land redistribution, infrastructural projects, all these things, women's rights in terms of healthcare and reproductive rights, anti-Catholic, right? So it's very interesting in the way that like he doesn't come across as a right wing or there's a famous line supposedly he says it's like he's socialist up to his elbows, right? And there's a way that like I think in a way it crosses those class formations in the same way that you can see in the kind of like in the supposed global north, the kinds of ways that certain kinds of leaders really resonate with their demos, right? The people in a strange, not strange, but maybe in an unexpected way. You would think that their political consciousness is not supposed to align with that, but for some reason their unconscious is perfectly aligned. So I think that's something to think about, especially as we're trying to, and I don't want to create a taxonomy. I don't think that's the point of the project, is to create a taxonomy of ideologies or something like that. But how do you situate something like fascism when it has so many I don't know, it's entangled so much with this idea of democracy, with ideas of these supposed liberal institutions that'll protect us, right? I don't know. I think that's some of the things that I think is worth exploring for both the global South and the global North.
And also draw a bit on that. I think it's definitely worth thinking about which groups get scapegoated in these moments and for what reasons, and to think about when especially white supremacist and white nationalist organizations kind of come out of the woodwork, regardless of who is politically in power. And I think that looking at the Canadian context can give us a bit of an understanding of that, where there is an increase in white supremacists, like the sort of visibility of white supremacist movements and organizing. And that's happening under a very liberal government, who when we look at Indigenous organizing, we've got our concerns with the government coming from a different direction. And you can see where these things are happening and what their centers are. So historically, one of the sort of main centers of white supremacist groups, people like the Sons of Odin, is British Columbia. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. One is a sort of high population of immigrants, and a real sort of like nationalist, close the borders kind of mentality. And I think another is the fact that in British Columbia, in that province, is the province with the most land that has not been covered by any sort of historical treaties. And so it's really unstable when it comes to colonial consolidation of power. And the state of the land as belonging to Canada or belonging to the province of BC is unstable for that reason. So we see sort of a real surge in white supremacist ideology in the public sphere, and the consolidation of these movements in places where there's the possibility of a struggle over land and the possibility of anti-colonial organizing happening. I think there's also some parallels when we think about when people feel emboldened to deputize in service of the state and in the service of white supremacist projects. And I think it is, it helps to look at the context evolving in Eastern Canada right now on Mi'kmaq territory, where there have been mobs basically of commercial fishermen attacking Indigenous fisheries and destroying property and threatening people's lives because of the fisheries' claim to a moderate livelihood and the ability to set lobster traps in that area. So this is a real, I think, illustration of what happens when you have a white population that is dealing with a real sort of scarcity mentality, coming from a place of real economic struggle, and finding an enemy in Indigenous people. And that kind of scapegoating is easily folded into a more fascist project. Those sort of broader organized political, like official political movements aren't happening in the same way in Canada as they are in other places. But I think you sort of see the threads of it happening in different places, and how that vast wealth inequality and the ways that a threat is identified in Indigenous people, and then the sort of population is mobilized to take out the threat. I think that's worth looking at, how those threads and how these sort of more white supremacist organizations can be functioning and working with this ideology, sometimes in the absence of a formal political program that's really leading them in that direction.
Thanks very much. So I'm going to just kind of shift courses a little bit to try to get, so Neda and Christina have been going through some of the comments that folks have been posting in the Q&A, comments and questions. And so as I said, I don't think we'll be able to get to a significant number of those, but I do want to say thanks to everybody who has been posting their questions. The conversation here hopefully will really be a starting point, a launching point for further further discussion, but I'm going to just start by reading the first kind of condensed version of a question that's posted here and pose that to our panelists. So it says, hello, I'm thinking about the relationship between colonialism and fascism, particularly the European conception of fascism as colonialism come home to roost. How should we understand fascism in states that have always been home to and were established through colonial violence? How can we distinguish fascist movements in colonial states from plain old colonialism? I don't know if panelists want to respond to that question, if anyone immediately has some thoughts.
I mean, I think that's one of the things that I was kind of thinking about from that Césaire's like discourse on colonialism, where he, you know, it's a very eloquent way of talking about a kind of ways that the supposed civil or Western civilization goes and debases themselves through colonialism, right? They dehumanize themselves, they become uncivil and savage, and that savagery is suddenly named only when it's happening in Europe, right? And it's sort of like this boomerang effect, this kind of like, looping effect. But I'm not quite sure that's necessarily how we should look at it. I mean, I think it's great. Césaire really pushes that upon us, but I think the way we should, the way I think others have been thinking about it, especially in critiques of settler colonialism, is that this is these kinds of categories between liberal or sort of fascistic or democratic or socialist, and all these things are born out of colonial encounters, right? And settler colonies are proof of that. It's ongoing. And so even though like these kinds of political formations, these political identities or ideologies are born out of colonial violence, a kind of quotidian violence, right? And so these kinds of structures that I think of it as like, it's like the supposed choice that you have to either be a socialist or a fascist is not one for the colonized. This is something that only comes from the colonizer. And so to me, it's always it's interesting for those who have been historically left out of so-called civil society, right? So those who were enslaved, those who were indigenous people, those who were excluded for other reasons. And that to me is, I think, something to keep in mind when trying to temporalize the idea of fascism, or even also spatialize it as if it goes somewhere else and then comes back, but actually something that fascism wouldn't be sort of the scandal of fascism wouldn't happen if not for sort of this historic disavowal of colonialism.
I wonder if I could jump in and just kind of build with these comments, because I think this is a question, and I think Alan's point is really astute about the ways in which fascism really confounds how we temporalize or periodize liberal democracy. And I think going back to Joanna's point about really locating fascism in a kind of crisis of capital accumulation, right? And there's actually debate whether it's actually a degeneration of capitalist structures, or if it's actually an ascendance of capitalism. And I think that there's a way that what the question of fascism might offer us is a certain way of reading continuities that will perennially be disavowed, but that also will break a certain law of capital, right? I think that it kind of really asks us to suspend how we we instrumentalize theories of race to capitalism, right? So I think that there's a way that the politics of racialized scapegoating, right, and the politics of capital accumulation can also work across purposes, right? And I think that there's a certain way that fascism comes into being only when there's also a kind of somewhat developed notion of liberal freedom, right? And so I think that that might be one way of distinguishing fascism from maybe colonialism, right? Whereas colonial projects don't necessarily need that logic of kind of liberal freedom, but there is a certain logic of liberal freedom that's based upon a certain logic of transcendence from the kind of like strictures of racialized colonial violence, right? And so I'm just trying to think that there's a way, like, I don't know, how do we name, I struggle with this all the time, like how do we name, the break from, when does capital become capitalism, right? So when does liberalism become fascism? When does colonialism become liberalism, right? So I do think that there is I don't know, it's a certain type of puzzle, right? But I think it's a puzzle that has pieces that kind of link back to different formations of colonialism, I think, as many of you pointed out. But I'm curious about, because one of the things I'm thinking about, especially with Joanna's presentation, is in the context of the US and naming the Jim Crow South and naming particularly like the ways in which lynchings become public events, right? And there's a certain kind of mediation that's involved in that, right? There's a certain kind of spectatorial position and a certain type of consumption of those kind of images of cruelty that's part of it, right? And so I'm wondering if that's also a part of what gives fascism its kind of, I don't know, autonomy, or its kind of like force, if it's that kind of, it's kind of, are the mediating structures, or the structures of mediation that are kind of also a part of it. I don't know, I'm just kind of trying to make sense of everything. I was going to toss that out there.
Well, there's definitely spectacle and ceremony that's involved. But I mean, we know that the administrators of fascism, in fact, studied the Negro question in the United States, in the South, right? And its logic and ideology. Yeah, its logics.
Well, and both were, the sort of fascists in Europe were inspired by the ways in which the U.S. Jim Crow laws, the sort of regime of terror in the sort of post-Reconstruction era, but also with the genocidal practices against Native peoples. So it's really like the way in which those two come together as object lessons for fascisms elsewhere, I think is a pretty notable piece about the way in which US history functions, not so much as the US likes to narrate itself as a kind of the sort of ultimate culmination of liberal freedom or democracy, but really that it's the kind of twining together of racial terror in kind of the afterlives of slavery and the specific ongoing permanent war against Native peoples and dispossession that becomes a kind of a model for other places as well.
I was going to mention that as well, the use specifically of the residential and industrial school model in fascist Germany, right, as a way of controlling and containing a population. So I think that there's a kind of borrowing that happens, that we can look at the techniques of fascism and the way that they borrow from colonial movements, but I think that the roots are different, and that we should be precise when we think about what the purpose of colonial movements is, and what the purpose of fascist movements is. And the root of colonization, and specifically of settler colonialism, is the occupation of territory, the use of land, and the extraction of resources from those territories, which happens in all sorts of different ways. So I think that there's an economic driver to that you know, is about that form of extraction that can continue in all sorts of different places. And that extraction can continue without necessarily needing a fascist mobilization to drive it. And so it's how a state like Canada can function and can continue to invade and extract from Indigenous territories without needing to consolidate power in an authoritarian way at all. And so I think there's also, this sort of idea of recruitment for the project, around who gets recruited into sort of this form of ideology, that we have to separate a bit what the roots of the economic roots of something are from the ideologies, and then the techniques that are actually continuing. And I definitely think there's a sort of sharing of techniques of racial terror across these different regimes. And that, you know, they're picking and choosing what they use, and they have a lot to choose from in colonized places when it comes to how to control and contain populations. So I think that's definitely worth thinking about. Yeah, and then just thinking about the sort of threats to capitalism that are happening in places that are sort of have fascist currents, and sort of the way that liberal states can continue to pull on the resources in the way that Indigenous people have always subsidized the creation of the state through land taken and stolen from Indigenous people. That that can continue to happen sort of regardless of how the consolidation of political power in that way. And so, yeah, I think it's more of a sharing of techniques and less, you know, to me, the sort of the phrase colonialism come home to roost doesn't really make a lot of sense to me, because like what aspects of colonialism are coming home and what's being deployed. I think there's something about, you know, military occupation and you know, the definitely in movements that are really heavily rooted in white supremacy, there's a sort of like empowerment around white power that's happening in various places, but that's not the core mechanism of colonialism, which is rooted in this kind of extractivism from Indigenous territories, specifically in the Americas. So yeah, I think that some precision is maybe necessary when we're talking about distinguishing between those two terms.
I mean, I think one thing that I was just thinking about was the kind of idea about capitalism as, or a capitalist crisis. Is it a capitalist crisis that creates the conditions for fascism, or is it monopolization, increased convergence of or accumulation that creates this, and you have fascism as a kind of reaction to that? And I don't know, it's strange because that's how historically it kind of gets narrated in that way, right? Because of the depression and the kind of debt that, for example, Germany was in to these other empires or whatever. But I think as everyone has been talking, it is about that kind of violence and that kind of racist violence, especially that we keep getting drawn to when we look at other forms, right? Or a kind of dispossession of devaluation of life for already racialized populations. And I'm curious, like, I mean, this is something that I've been thinking about in terms of racial capitalism in general, is anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity, is this anterior to racial capitalism, which is to say, is that kind of, the lynching, for example, of the spectacle of it, is that something that is drawing from something beyond a kind of accumulation of profit, right? So in the same way that what we would label as fascist now, Hitler or Mussolini or something, the kind of pleasure that comes from kind of this mass death or the kind of violence upon particular groups of people. And that's just something you know, I think, yeah, I'm thinking about, even though I like to always write about capitalism, it's something that I'm like, is it really about capitalism, right? Or is capitalism obviously just found ways to capture value out of this already anti-Black, anti-Indigenous world, right? So that's just something.
Well, I think it's important to know that in the traditional narrative of fascism in Europe, it was a response to a working class rebellion, right? And that's a very integral part of this. It's capitalism in crisis, and capitalism falls into crisis of overaccumulation and production in the face of a socialist threat, a working class threat. I don't know if that helps the conversation. That's also part of the equation. And in many ways, fascism is the deployment of terror for the purposes of survival. Which under particular conditions of economic crisis and resistance. And we see that, I mean, we see that in the early colony. I mean, this is what Ortiz talks about. There was a deployment of terror against Native Americans because Native Americans were fighting back, right? So there has to be an active struggle. And I mean, I'm thinking about Palestine. You go to Palestine and it looks like Germany. And that is an active site of resistance on the part of displaced colonized people, right? And so in that context, there has to be an unforgiving terror and repression to bring that resistance to heal, which threatens the settler colonial project, right?
I mean, I guess I would just say that's also that content, sort of exactly what you're describing is true throughout the settler colonies altogether, even like so the United States, Canada, you know, that it is that degree of always present force, or the recruitment, exactly as you described earlier, the sort of solicitation of identification of those who, you know, want to at least invest in the idea of their inclusion to enact that violence. I mean, that's what we see again and again. So I think it's not, I mean, Palestine, it's obviously, it's very much the case, but I think that it's also important to sort of see that line of continuity. And here's where I think, like, I agree, like, with what Anne was saying about, like, attending to the specificities, but at the same time, as I think, like, there's, you know, or even what Alan was saying, there, you know, there, of course, there's an outside of capitalism that kind of shapes the ways in which, you know, the capitalist formation responds to, in certain extents. I mean, that's the whole process of so-called primitive accumulation, is that ongoing process through which supposed what gets called growth happens. But those are all reactive formations. So I think, like, something like Manu Caraca's notion of counter sovereignty is really important, to think of the way that capitalism functions and colonialism both function in response to the resistance they consistently and always encounter, right? So even in the context of what Anne was describing in Canada, I think it's really important to also talk about the way in which Canada is, like, both actively anti-Black. There's a kind of pervasive anti-Blackness, but that there's the ongoing disavowal of that. So there's this, I mean, in a way, it's different and yet also not different from what happens in the US. So I think that what folks are talking about are the different ways that we have to kind of attend to specificity, but I also, it's like, what I want is to think about is how do we attend to that specificity, but also keep in mind the connections and tensions across those differences. Anyway, I don't know if anyone, we should probably begin to wrap up. Do folks have any kind of final comments that you want to kind of raise in our last moments?
I'll maybe speak to that really quickly. I think that there's something about the demographic differences as well that is categorizing who counts as a legitimate threat to the state, and then what kind of response can be mounted to put down that threat. And in Canada, for the most part, dispatching Indigenous resistance as a threat doesn't require a massive recruitment of people as sort of agents of the state. I mean, it still happens in some places, but the Liberal project alone, people can be passively complicit in the dispossession of Indigenous lands and passively support the sort of putting down of Indigenous resistance without having to resort to some sort of bigger recruitment to a white supremacist project. And so a lot of those currents, you're right, do happen under the surface. And so there's a disavowal of that as like the sort of underlying racial reality of the Canadian state as a very anti-Black, anti-Indigenous colonial state. But again, it's sort of because of the way that they evaluate us as a threat or not. There's a way that plays out sort of under the umbrella of liberal democracy that, when something more spectacular does happen, people pay attention, but they see it as an anomaly, that like that instance of violence, that's not us, that's not Canada. And I think that there's something at play there with the way that politics gets narrated in the public sphere.
Just one last thing is that just listening to everybody is just one thing that I'm also thinking about for the essay is just how, as I think it was mentioned, counter-revolutionary force, or fascism as counter-revolutionary, right, inherently. So, and I think that's something that, thinking about Du Bois's counter-revolutionary property and how I think that really cuts across the ways that a lot of the logic for, in the United States or in the Philippines, for example, a lot of the logic is that aspiration that I have, my property will be, whether it's very little or very much, it will be affected by either communists, by anarchists, by Black Lives Matter, by all these different kinds of revolutionary type groups. And I think that's something that has a connection, obviously, to capital, but it also, especially in the case of colonialism, precedes capital in a lot of ways. So I think that's something that I'm going to be thinking about, and hopefully we can maybe think together on that too.
I guess I'll say in response to some of the things I heard is that the balance of power and the balance of forces at any given moment is what drives the intensity of the terror and repression, right? So Native Americans in the South were not central to that struggle. And they were, there's just plenty of examples of Native Americans challenging white supremacists and being celebrated by white supremacists as the people with, manhood. But Black Americans who were central to the economy and who were in fact attempting to reorganize the economy at different moments, those were the people who had to be contained with the pogroms. So context and, the balance of power and your relationship to the means of production and the state and the political economy can't be overlooked in this calibration of extreme repression that's fascistic like.
Thank you all for your comments. I mean, I feel like definitely a conversation that we could just continue having, and hopefully that element of what we're talking now, or this is a way for us to kind of be in conversation going into the pieces written for the issue. And we'll also have another panel next week, as Neda had said, on the 4th, the same time. And for those folks who are attending, I think your registration for this also facilitates participating or attending that as well. So I just want to thank Alan and Joanna so much for being with us, sharing your thoughts, and thanks everybody for attending. So just my appreciation to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you so very much.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.